and we have Keegan with us today. Keegan is Director for Global Sourcing, Nature-Based Solutions, South Pole, which is one of the world's largest carbon project developers. So very curious to hear what you're going to share today, Keegan. Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you, Peter, for putting together Wall Street Green, and Michelle and my other panelists who we have quite a diverse array of things to speak about, it seems. I am, as Julie mentioned, I work at South Pole, which is a carbon asset development company. We are 15 years old, one of the larger sort of carbon market, carbon credit creators. My job is to globally originate projects in a variety of sectors that that are related to nature. So functioning ecosystems that humans protect, much like Michelle alluded to. If the ecosystems aren't supporting the wildlife and the ecosystems themselves aren't supporting communities, we enter into a downward spiral collectively as a species and a civilization on this planet. Carbon markets are one tool to engage in positive conservation activities. The work that I work on is called collectively nature-based solutions, or sometimes they're called natural carbon solutions. I'm going to see if I can share a screen here and get to the right spot. Let's see. I think if I go here, share, let me get to, hang on, let me get to a different screen. Sorry, everybody. It's always like that, isn't it? Here we go. Shoot, how do I share that screen? It's every single time it's a slightly different, here we go. It's very 2020 here. All right, 2022, here we are. South Pole, what I'm gonna talk about, again, nature-based solutions, the quick and dirty sort of how we create projects that have access to carbon finance, and carbon capital. I think I'm gonna start backwards now that I think about this audience being Wall Street Green. I'm gonna start with the demand in the voluntary carbon market, and sort of show you some of the numbers of what these carbon market credits have looked like from 2010 to current time. This is essentially a graph of market retirements, or when people use carbon credits to offset some sort of emission. And you'll notice that it's renewable power, and it is avoidance or REDD projects, reduced emissions of CO2 from deforestation or forest degradation. The other piece of the nature-based solutions work here is called removals, which is really afforestation, reforestation, or planting. So you can see there's an upward trend in the market, and then here you go with the upward trend specifically as it pertains to the nature-based work, which is total avoidance or reduced emissions. And this is mostly conservation work and working with communities to engage with ecosystems in a better way. And this is planting. And if the pricing and the value of those credits are pretty similar in terms of growth. The value specifically of nature-based solutions work is that the carbon benefit, once it's created and verified and audited, these are all third-party audited, transparent processes, and we're going to hear about traceability, trust, and transparency, I think, a little bit later from Simon. But these qualities of a credit are coming essentially from certified standards and third-party auditors that have gone and looked at your project to determine that what you've done is actually benefited the atmosphere. Now, nature-based solutions in general are one type of these credits, and they come from us as humans and all of the community members that both live in forests or in landscapes and work to improve the way that we do that and manage those landscapes. We can increase carbon sinks and or establish new carbon sinks. And one of the ways we do that is through forestry. For example, land that's slated to be cut in concession in Central Africa or Asia or Latin America, we can work with those concession owners to change their harvesting regime so that more carbon stays on site, more trees stay on site, or A log to protected status is a type of a carbon market activity. We then will measure all the trees and the carbon in the trees, and we can quantify the climate benefit that has come from that, and those then are then brokered in the carbon market. Typically, a nature-based solutions project will start. We'll have a number of activities that wouldn't happen under normal circumstances. It's a way to change the standard business practice. So a business as usual case doesn't get carbon credits. You have to do something special and different. It's called additional in carbon market speak, to generate those carbon credits and just get them justified by third-party auditors. Once you get them created, they get registered on a trading platform, much like Wall Street. Those trading platforms will broker credits, and we will then return funds back for the continued implementation, operation, and management of these projects, which in most NBS projects, nature-based solutions projects, is about a 30-year time period. So we'll invest in changing the behavior and the management on the ground in a way that benefits the atmosphere, and that then will allow us to create a positive cash flow for a project for about a 30-year period, or the crediting period, which depends a little bit on different projects. So we work a lot on forestry, we work a lot on agriculture, and we work on wetlands, peatlands, and marine environments. And all the time it's about how can we change the management on the ground to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases or to sequester more of them in usually biomass. So that's the big piece of the puzzle. Let me just give you a quick rundown of the types of activities that we work on. And again, I work globally with a team of, wow, we have about 50 different people in the sourcing team. South Pole has got over 800 people globally in 40 offices around the world. We've developed over 1,000 certified carbon credit projects in the last 15 years. And our plan is to try to account for a gigaton of carbon by 2026. Just to give everybody a sense, we need about 8 or 9 gigatons of carbon to be sequestered or not emitted in order to achieve a 1.5 degrees C kind of variability in the climate, which is what we're all targeting. I'm not sure that we're going to make that goal at the moment. We're not on track to do so. But in order to do 6 to 8 gigatons, the only technology we have right now on planet Earth at scale that could do that is planet Earth itself. The ecosystems on the planet, we've evolved for millennia to try to maintain the growth function that's evolved in all of these species. We can harness that power to try to reduce the CO2 emissions, or all greenhouse gas emissions. And the only thing, again, that we can harness right now that's mobilizable in the market to try to address the problem as we've defined it is nature, which could account for about 6 gigatons. We need alternative power, sustainable technologies, carbon capture and storage. We need a whole slew of alternative energy choices and to uncouple from fossil fuels. But to achieve the needed goal, we need nature, and we need to treat her right and understand how we can improve. In forestry terms, we can plant trees, we can rehabilitate or regenerate places that have been degraded. We can incorporate agroforestry systems and silvopastoral, which means trees and rangeland animals, to generate great value for communities and people who are usually have economic pressures to go and deforest, right? So if we can address the drivers of deforestation by adding value and financial alternative livelihood activities, we can try and reduce the pressure on the forests, which would then allow us to protect them. Right, the golden rule of conservation is protect what you've got and then plant to improve. So, and then improve forest management. A lot of this has to do with sort of existing logging activities, and you change the way you log to leave more biomass on site. In agriculture, there's a slew of improved cropping systems, improved water management, reducing tillage, and improved residue management, incorporating that back into soils. A lot of work going into livestock feed supplements, which reduce the methane in ruminant burping. Cows, everybody talks about cows being a big problem. It's really that when they double digest foods, they emit a lot of methane. So we can improve grazing practices, herd management, feed additives. In wetlands and marine systems, you might have heard of the term blue carbon. Again, it's about conservation and protection, especially of such a key habitat that mangroves are. And planting in some cases to rehabilitate and reestablish protected status. There's a lot of policy work that can be done with governments. And these areas are key, not just for carbon, but for all of the communities that use those ecosystems to live and to sustain themselves. How does a project qualify for carbon credits? And Peter has a copy of this presentation, and I'm assuming he'll post it in the Wall Street Green website or something. So don't worry about, I'm sure I'm not going to get to all the slides, but you're welcome to check them out later. There are certain qualities that a carbon credit has to have, right? Like when you think of a commodity, any commodity, there are certain things that it has to entail in order to become a carbon credit. It has to be real, meaning it's on the ground, it took place already. It has to be additional from the point of view of the atmosphere. She gets a chemistry benefit. We have to be able to measure it according to known terms that are agreed upon by auditors and certification standards. Has to be verifiable by multiple third parties using those standards. Has to be permanent, which typically for nature-based solutions is a 100-year period. And it has to be unique, meaning each carbon credit that it's created gets a vintage year and a serial number or some other process depending on the standard used, whether it's current carbon markets or tokenization of the future. The people that participate are the people that control the resources or the lands, some sort of project partner, which has the rights to the carbon asset. Usually those are the same. Up here is a South Pole, like a project developer that turns the land asset from these people and the forest asset or what have you into a project according to known rules that are transparent and understood. Third-party outside auditors then come certify, and then you're able to have carbon credits for sale. There's a lot of energy in Wall Street these days, and not just Wall Street, but globally for investments, creating financial investment vehicles to engage in carbon projects because prices have increased so much. So it's an interesting time. There's a number of known certification standards that I'm not going to go into, but just know that there are standards that we have to comply with in order to register credits. For a typical forestry project, just to get a sense, there's a bunch of different biomass fractions in a tree or a forest that we account for. Above ground biomass, below ground biomass, soil organic carbon, a little bit on, and depending on the forest type, we look at dead wood and litter and or long-lived wood products. We aggregate all of those up into a carbon credit number that's usually done on a per hectare per year basis that enables us to ensure that we don't get unintended reversals, which is carbon speak for like an insurance pool, and allows us to ensure permanence into the future. Certain types of activities that usually occur are like ranger patrols or protection activities, communities protecting their forests from being invaded or cut by outside parties, reforestation, lots of forest fire work, community livelihoods work, anything that we could do to reduce pressure on the forest. I'll give you an example. We work with community-based projects that engage water filters and stoves. So improve stoves instead of cooking, essentially with an unenclosed stove itself, which is common in many parts of the world. We enclose the stove, it needs less wood, which means people are pulling less firewood out of the forest, which means we have less degradation. We can measure that, and we can then add that to something that's commodified and sold, and it goes back into improving the local community livelihoods and reducing pressure on the forest at the same time. I think with that, I'm probably going to stop. These last couple slides describe a process from moving your project through development and registration, selling, and then sending money back into the project. And then South Pole, we often we develop carbon assets at risk. So if somebody has a project idea or a community they work with, we'll work with them to bring a project to market at our own risk and broker those credits so that it's not that they need to invest their own money up front. We'll take on that risk on our own dime. We also have a bunch of investment models where we work on joint ventures or special purpose vehicles or things of that nature to bring capital to bear on natural resource management. We work a fair amount. Michelle was talking about green hydrogen, which was sort of like it's like a public-private partnership model where private capital and government capital are probably coming together, or this pilot, which is really private driven. South Pole works in a bunch of different modalities depending upon the finances available, the scale of the project, and the technology used. So with that, I thank you all for your attention. Hopefully that was interesting. I liked it. We've got 87 participants, and I will get to some of these questions in the chat.
Yeah, Keegan, I was going to say, can we kick off with what's the average timeline for a project?
Super, great question.
Yeah.
So often, and it's changing as the carbon price has increased, the intense pressure on generating new projects and investing new projects has meant the applications to the carbon credit standards, let me go this way, has gone nothing but up. With more applications, the certifying standards get sort of time blocked because they're now not able to process everything in good time. So it used to take between 12 and 18 months. And now I would say it's 18 to 24 months. And it's really because the market, sort of the human personnel involved in creating this market is a limiting factor. So give it, a year and a half to 2 years from when we start to selling credits that are registered on a third-party platform.
Wow, it's much faster actually than I understood it. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have several questions that have come in that are slightly similar around biodiversity and complete cycles of carbon in nature-based solutions. Like, how does that affect kelp? How does that affect mangroves? Are there additional income streams from projects that have biodiversity materials? Can you speak to that?
I can speak to part of it. There's also, Simon is going to speak later about biodiversity credits specifically. And indeed, there is, when you work in nature-based solutions, there is a whole slew of what I would just call co-benefits. Unlike a renewable energy project or a green hydrogen project where you're replacing a fuel, when you're protecting an environment, you have habitat improvement benefits for the community. You have a bunch of different social benefits because people rely on those lands in a way that's different than, perhaps having a different energy supply come into their house, but they still have, they're still farming. They still need soil improvements. They still need ecosystems to moderate flood waters. They still need watershed management. So the types of benefits that a nature-based solutions can bring is not just carbon, it's sort of carbon plus, and biodiversity is a big one. And we also work a lot on water, integrated landscapes. Often we try to connect island fragments of habitat with each other at a landscape scale to allow migrating animals to move between fragments without crossing habitat that isn't really their own or is very risky, like road crossings are pretty rough on most animals. I would also venture to say that there are co-benefit standards that aren't quite as formalized as the carbon standards at the moment, but South Pole works almost exclusively with something called the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standard. And we do a full carbon credit standard, and then we do a co-benefit standard, and we like to merge those together. The co-benefit standard usually gets us some sort of a price premium. Historically, it's been about $1 a ton that we get when we have climate, community, and biodiversity all monitored and incorporated into the carbon. There are other standards, of course, that track co-benefits. And I think as the market for carbon improves and matures, we're about 20 years into it now, a little over that, as a global experiment on how to commodify and move carbon. We're improving on how we're going to address these co-benefits, specifically biodiversity, which I believe we'll do water after that maybe. But I think biodiversity is next for sure. It's in the incipient stages of formalizing how we measure, monitor, and report it. But they work together, certainly. Commodifying nature in and of itself may be tricky, but we're not trying to do that. We're just trying to commodify the carbon component in the short term because the problem is so big, we need to address the climate realities, because if we don't address those, all those other co-benefits that we're trying to protect also suffer.
Exactly. We have just about a minute left. So maybe one more question about soil organic carbon. Are there protocols that are coming along to better understand what's happening with carbon in soil?
Absolutely. Great question. And, you know, if you can't see it, it's tough to measure, right? That's proven to be true in the natural sciences. Soil organic carbon, there are a number of protocols that we use that have been the certification methodologies that we apply to lands in the world to create credits have been approved by third parties, including the certifying entities at ICROA, which is an association of like high quality carbon projects and carbon standards. We are learning a lot about how soil organic carbon responds to different types of activities. It is measurable, albeit it used to be really hard. It's getting slightly easier for us to measure soil organic carbon. It is a long-term soil carbon sink, so we like that. Once it gets mineralized into soil carbon, it's at the century time scale before it's sort of mobilized, and we're more conservative with our presentation of the benefits that we have with respect to soil organic carbon, because it's a longer term and slightly more difficult to measure carbon sink. But as therefore we take the more conservative sort of end of a range of options at every step. And it's slightly slower to sequester CO2 than say biomass or plant matter, but it's also slower to mobilize and release that CO2. So yeah, we're learning a lot about that, and we use it, and it is indeed counted as part of the crediting amount that comes from nature-based solutions projects.
Fantastic. Keegan,
Time up,
thank you
I see
so
that.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.